Would you like my iPad? Do you want this one set up? It's vineyard spelled with a whatnot one. Yes, one. Okay.
Okay, I believe we are now live and streaming on YouTube. Thank you everybody who is joining us. I'm sorry for the hiccup. I'm sorry we're not on the CCHQ platform, but we've had various technical difficulties going on in the background. But I am absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the Centre for Policy Studies Fringe event on Going for Growth and the role of tax reform. We've got an absolutely outstanding panel of speakers with us today. I will introduce them very briefly before we let them get on with opening remarks, have a few questions and hopefully some debates between the panelists, and then make sure we get time for plenty of questions from the audience as well. So first off, it is a privilege to introduce Sir John Redwood, who not only is obviously a member of Parliament and a politician of seniority, he is also a businessman in his own right and was a policy advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Scott Hodge, who is president of the US-based Tax Foundation, which under his leadership has grown to be the foremost policy outfit on tax in the US. Sam Bowman, who's the Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics and a former director of the Adam Smith Institute. And finally, the CPS's own Tom Clougherty, who is an expert on tax and has spent time on the issue both in Westminster and in Washington. So I think without further ado, I will hand over to Sir John for his opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Tax is always very taxing. Indeed, governments recognise that because governments often use taxes to stop people doing things or to get people doing fewer of the things that they would otherwise like doing. And we see them taxing alcohol because they want us to drink less. We see them taxing tobacco because they want us to smoke less. We see them taxing travelling by car because they don't like the flexibility of the vehicle and are worried about some of the emissions. But we also find that taxing spills over into things that they either expressly approve of or ought to approve of. And one of the reasons I think we need to discuss tax, and we need to make the case again for lower taxes and flatter taxes, is that we are still taxing work, jobs, enterprise, investment, saving, enterprise in the sense of finding new things to do and offering better goods and services far too much. And it strikes me as very odd that all the political parties, if you ask them, will agree that the promotion of jobs and the promotion of greater prosperity and the promotion of higher living standards is central to what they're doing. Our disagreements about how you do them. But then most of the parties go off and say, and by the way, we do think that as soon as someone earns a little bit more, they ought to be taxed a lot more. As soon as someone thinks of a better way of doing something, we ought to tax their enterprise. As soon as somebody dares to make a profit, we ought to tax their profit. As soon as people decide they're going to work longer hours, let's tax them much more for daring to want to work longer hours. As soon as they work smarter and earn more money, let us tax them more. And I think we do need to go back to making the case for lower and flatter taxes on jobs, enterprise, saving, investment, because it is central to our recovery from here, central to levelling up around the country in the United Kingdom, central to dealing with these huge changes that are being hurled at us by the digital revolution and the green revolution, that we make it more worthwhile for people to work, more worthwhile for them to save, more worthwhile for them to invest. So I've been a long-standing advocate of lower income tax rates, lower capital gains tax rates, lower rates of profits tax, above all, lower rates of tax on saving and enterprise, because we need more companies, not fewer. We need more work, not less work. And surely we should celebrate the strivers, the entrepreneurs, those who want to make something of their lives by serving the rest of us better. So I'm very much in favour of lower taxes, which in due course will bring in more tax revenue because we'll have so much more going on in our country.
Thank you. That's quite a nice, fiery, punchy way to start. I like it. Scott, if we could pass over to you next, would be great.
Well, yes, thank you, Emily, and I appreciate those words by the Sir John. Very inspiring. I wish we had more voices like that in the United States. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you virtually. This is obviously a very important moment in UK history, and no doubt for the Conservative Party. Every country is understandably doing everything possible to keep their economy afloat during this crisis. And that includes running up very large public debts that will come due once the crisis is over. And a lot of countries may feel that they need to raise taxes to pay off those debts. And that'd be the worst medicine at the wrong time for an economy that's still struggling to recover from the COVID-induced coma. The smarter solution would be, as Sir John mentioned, make pro-growth tax reforms to your system today so that the economy will be better able to recover once the crisis is passed. And clearly, a growing economy will be much more able to manage the debt load that the government has incurred during the crisis. But as importantly, the UK tax system is not as competitive globally as it needs to be. So enacting reasonable tax reforms now will also put you ahead of your global competitors as they try to recover themselves. Well, let me share with you the Tax Foundation's assessment of the competitiveness of the UK tax system. In a little over 1 week, on October 14th, the Tax Foundation will release its 2020 edition of our International Tax Competitiveness Index. And this index uses more than 40 key indicators to rank the 36 OECD countries on the quality and competitiveness of their tax systems. And these indicators include such things as the corporate income tax, personal income tax, consumption taxes, property taxes, and finally, your international tax rules. And the index measures how neutral each of those components are. In other words, how little they impact the economy. The index also compares country tax rates. Low marginal tax rates are more competitive and thus better for economic growth. And these indicators all tier up into an international ranking. Well, here's an advanced look at the results. So please don't tell anybody for a week. As the UK has for the past few years, your tax system ranks well below average, 22nd overall of the 36 OECD countries. Estonia ranks number 1, as it has for the past few years, with the most competitive tax system in the OECD. Estonia has a great corporate tax system and a neutral tax system overall. Well, this year, Italy ranks dead last with the worst or least competitive tax system, which I suppose should surprise no one. But I can also say that the UK now ranks just below the United States, which has moved up in the rankings thanks to the tax reforms it enacted in 2017. Now, the UK tax system does have some strengths. Your 19% corporate tax rate is a plus, competitive. Your territorial system is very good. In fact, our index ranks you number 1 on the International Tax Rules Index. But there are weaknesses, and I'll mention 2 of them. The VAT rate, 20%, applies to less than half of all the potential consumption base. And you have just too many zero-rated items. If you had a VAT base like Estonia, you could use those extra revenues to fix a lot of other ills in the tax system, including your relatively poor treatment of capital investment, especially for industrial buildings. In fact, the UK is tied with Hungary for the worst treatment for industrial buildings. And not only does that disadvantage your manufacturing base, but workers suffer when capital investment declines. And I think that there's evidence to suggest that much of the discontent that you have among working class people can be attributed to how poorly capital investment has been treated over the past few decades. Lower corporate tax rates are great for financial services and high-tech firms and companies that have a lot of intellectual property. Well, that's been great for London, but not the industrial heartland. So if you want to address inequality, improve the tax treatment of capital investment and manufacturing. And let me just say in closing that our index does not take into account the digital services tax that the government is considering and planning on, nor policies such as the diverted profits tax. If we included those measures, the UK would rank much worse than it does today. Well, if you really want to teach the EU a lesson, I would suggest that you set a national goal to design a comprehensive tax reform plan that makes the United Kingdom the most competitive tax system in the industrialized world. Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you, Scott. Just before I pass over to Sam, I am going to encourage people to ask questions either in the YouTube chat below or by tweeting the CPS, which is at CPS Think Tank. And now I will hand over to Sam.
Great, thanks very much. In some ways, I want to pick up where Scott left off by talking about the way we tax capital in the UK. Before doing that, Scott did a really great job of putting the UK's tax system in international context. But I want to just put the UK's economic performance over the last 10 years in international context. Since the financial crisis, productivity in the UK has grown by 1.4%. To be clear, that's not 1.4% per year, which would be not very good. That's 1.4% over 10 years. It's the worst performance of any G7 country apart from Italy. Between 1995 and 2015, we had the lowest capital investment rate of any OECD country. Since Brexit, and I'm not necessarily saying it's because of Brexit, investment has fallen off a cliff. The Bank of England expected investment to add 1.8% to GDP in the following 3 years after 2015. In fact, it added 0.3%. And investment was down 2.5% year on year at the end of 2018, which is the most recent year that I have data for. So it looks as if we're investing a very, very, very small amount by global standards. Productivity is very, very low by global standards, and it looks as if things are not getting any better. So how do taxes affect this? Scott talked about the treatment of capital investment, but I want to explain how this works. The UK's capital tax system is designed to tax profits. And the way we do that is look at how much revenue a company is bringing in, and look at how much it's spending, what its expenditure is, and what's left is profit. So you can deduct things like rent, like pens and paper, like wages from your tax bill, because that's your expenditure, and what's left is profit. All of those things, and for many items like computers, you can deduct those costs over a very small number of years. So effectively, you deduct the whole cost from your tax bill. But when it comes to long-lived assets like machinery or industrial buildings, or intellectual property in some cases, you can deduct the value of those things over the notional lifespan of the investment, which can be something like 30 or 50 years. And what that means, because of inflation and because of the time value of money, that's things you could do with that money other than investing in that asset, businesses, in fact, are not able to deduct the full value of investments in machinery, factories, new buildings, some research and development, some intellectual property. So what that means is that, in fact, while they can deduct all of the cost of their wages today, they cannot deduct all of the cost of capital investment at all. In real terms, they end up being able to deduct only 76% of machinery investment and only 28%, at least last time I checked, the numbers change almost every year, for building investment. And up until recently, it was 0% of building investment. All of the money you invested in buildings was treated as if you had taken that money as profit. With machinery, it's about a quarter of the money is treated as if you've taken that as profit. And so we wonder why businesses are reluctant to invest, and we wonder why we have such a low level of investment by international standards. And in particular, we wonder why parts of the country that are dependent on heavy machinery, physical investment, are doing much worse than parts of the country that are dependent on basically highly skilled workers, wages, and rented office space in the middle of cities. By international standards, and Scott did a great job of giving a kind of an overview of the kind of really important parts of the tax code, but on this particular item, what's called capital cost recovery, the UK does 35th out of 36 in the OECD. The only country that is worse than the UK for this is Chile. And this actually got even worse under the Osborne chancellorship, under the Cameron government. In order to pay for the reductions in the headline rate of corporation tax, the Osborne government, or the Osborne chancellorship, made these allowances that we allow businesses to deduct the value of these investments, made them less generous. So even as the headline rate was falling, the actual amount of business investment that you could deduct was falling as well. So it massively depressed the value of the headline corporation tax cut rates. So my proposal is quite simple, that we allow businesses to deduct investments in machinery and in buildings in the same way that they deduct investments in pens and paper and in workers, which is right now and in full. If we did that, there's evidence from the US that suggests investment could increase by 17.5%, wages could increase by 2.5%. That's basically one really good year. And other evidence from the UK suggests that if we did that focused on machinery only, we could increase investment by 11%. That would make the cost quite a bit lower. And one of the key reasons to do this isn't just because we need a lot of economic growth. And usually at this point when I'm giving this talk, this is the time when I'd start to talk about how we pay for this. But we're in such exceptional and unfortunate times that really that's a consideration for some years down the line. We need all the growth we can get right now and all the investment we can get right now, or we will in a few months. But one of the key reasons to do this isn't just to get economic growth. It's to help remove the bias regionally in the economy that punishes parts of the country that would be dependent and could be quite prosperous on a manufacturing base that wasn't held back by the tax code, but right now has to suffer from a bias that favors services in the economy, favors the rich parts of the country in London, the Southeast, and some of the other cities that are driven by highly skilled workers, and penalizes any kind of business that wants to make money and wants to improve the welfare of its workers by investing in capital and machinery and buildings. So if we fix this bias, we'll significantly increase investment, we'll significantly increase workers' wages, we'll significantly increase economic growth, and will significantly help not to rebalance the economy, but to raise up parts of the economy that have been punished by an unfair and discriminatory and biased tax code. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. And finally, Tom.
Oh, there we go. Got my volume back on. At the risk of sort of exposing a lack of diversity of thinking on this panel, I strongly agree with lots of what's been said so far. And indeed, I know this doesn't come as a surprise to Scott. He said that Britain needed a comprehensive tax reform plan to make it the most competitive economy in the developed world. And I've spent a lot of the last year working actually with colleagues of Scott's at the Tax Foundation on precisely such a plan for the UK. We've been using the International Tax Competitiveness Index to really do an in-depth audit of the UK tax system to see where it does well, where it particularly falls down against its developed world competitors, and then coming up with ideas for how we can improve that. Now, having said that, everyone probably wants me to reveal the list of ideas that will miraculously turn around Britain's economic prospects. It's not quite ready yet. You'll have to come back in a week or so. I'm not going to spoil everything for you now. But so instead, what I'm going to do is kind of take a step back from the discussion so far and just focus on a handful of the key principles, I think, behind pro-growth tax reform and maybe some of the challenges we face in putting them into action. So I think the first way you can approach pro-growth tax reform is to think about lower marginal tax rates. This is very much what John said. If you tax something less, you get more of it. And if you want more jobs, if you want more profit, if you want more investment, tax it less, you'll get more. And that really ties into Scott's approach as well, looking at international competitiveness. COVID-19 notwithstanding, we do live in a globalized world economy. Capital is very mobile. And so countries do have to be nimble. They have to pay attention to their relative standing. Because if you start to look at a less appealing prospect for investment than other developed world economies, you may find jobs and investments and businesses going elsewhere. You don't want that. So yeah, cut marginal tax rates. The problem, of course, is that the government needs revenue. They always need revenue. Maybe they need it even more at the moment. And all things being equal, if you cut taxes, you tend, in the short term at least, to get lower revenues. What's the possible solution? I think you focus on cutting those taxes that are having the worst impact on economic growth. So stamp duty might be one of those, for example. There might be aspects of corporation tax you look at as well. I would love to just cut the overall tax burden. I think probably most people watching would agree. All conservatives after all. But I think in the short term, focus and highlighting the areas that are really doing the most damage to our growth prospects at the moment is the way forward. The second big principle, I think, behind pro-growth tax reform is neutrality, leaving economic decisions to individuals and businesses to make based on their economic merits, not having government distort decision making, not having government sort of encourage present consumption over future consumption, not sort of pushing investment in particular directions, not taxing particular business models like digital companies more than you would tax the wider economy as a whole. And that's it's a well-established and well-understood principle among sort of tax policy experts, economists, and so on. The big challenge there is that politics, I think, tends relentlessly to pull you in the opposite direction. It tends to, want to bring in special tax regimes or targeted tax breaks. And so there's a real challenge there, I think, of almost running to stand still, or perhaps you've really got to fight from being dragged away from neutrality at the same time as trying to advance a more neutral, more pro-growth tax system. So there's a political challenge there, I think. The final aspect of pro-growth tax reform I just want to touch on is one of the balance of the tax system. And what I mean by that is that we know pretty well, actually, that certain types of taxes are particularly damaging to growth, and other types of taxes are relatively more benign. The OECD has a very authoritative study on this, and they found that the most damaging taxes were those on corporate profits, then those on personal incomes. Consumption taxes were relatively better, and then some kinds of property taxes, stuff like council tax, they found from a growth perspective, relatively benign. Important to stress when you say property taxes are relatively benign, that probably the single most damaging tax we have in this country is stamp duty land tax. So that's another kind of property tax, but it's a very bad type of property tax. It's one that has a very significant impact on growth. But now, if we know that certain taxes are better for growth than others, and if we want to get more economic growth and prioritize that, the obvious thing to do is to rebalance the tax system so you gain more revenue from those areas that don't harm the economy as much, and relatively less revenue from those areas that do. So what does that mean? Well, you might want to shift towards property taxes a bit more. That's tricky, though, because Britain already taxes property. We get a lot of revenue from property taxes as a percentage of GDP. It's actually by far the highest in the OECD. So I think there's significant scope for reform in property taxes, and probably shifting the burden among property owners and occupiers in a different way. And maybe there's room for a little bit more revenue there. But you're not going to get a huge amount. I think where you have the greatest scope for rebalancing in the tax system is to shift more towards consumption taxes. And ideally, sort of broad-based consumption taxes like VAT would be the best way to go there. Here's the problem with that. This is not kind of a new insight. And the issue you always have with a shift towards consumption taxation is that consumption taxes are seen as regressive, as weighing more heavily on poorer members of society. And that, I think, for a long time has stymied the attempt to do things like broaden the VAT base and then cut other taxes in compensation, or to shift income tax to a more, and indeed corporation tax, to a more consumption base, which would mean excluding investment from what you're taxing. But I think we have to get past that, and we have to think very carefully about how we can prioritize taxing consumption over taxing other things that we want to see more of. I think, and again, I'm not going to spoil recommendations that will soon be forthcoming, but I think we can think about ways to make VAT a fairer and more efficient tax that doesn't weigh as heavily on people lower down the economic scale, and yet does still have that broader tax base that can bring in more revenue. I think we can also think about ways to make both corporation tax and personal income taxes function effectively more like consumption taxes, right? So that you're not taxing capital as heavily, you're not weighing on investment and work as much, and you're sort of encouraging saving, you're encouraging investment and all those things that you want to see more of. So look, to me, that is kind of the recipe for a pro-growth tax reform, looking at where you can cut marginal tax rates, looking at how you can, first of all, stop the government from making the tax system less neutral, but also, encourage neutrality where you can. And thirdly, to look at the balance of the tax system, to try and raise more money from consumption taxes and cut taxes on production, and also to reform Britain's property taxes so that stamp duty isn't such a problem, and so that revenues raised more effectively through things like business rates and council tax without some of the economic distortions that they have at the moment. So Emily, that's about all from me for my opening remarks.
Thank you. So I would say questions already, I know, starting to come in thick and fast. So I will keep my part of the questions on the short side. But as a reminder, if you've just joined us, please contribute your questions in the YouTube live chat or by tweeting us at CPS Think Tank. But firstly, I'm actually going to pick up on one of Tom's final points, which is balance in the tax system, and touching on, I think everybody mentioned at some point or another kind of investment into the UK and making sure that we are leveling up and growing our economy, which is obviously the basis for this whole conversation. But we all also most of us spend a lot of time in Westminster, and we listen to the Westminster rumour mill. And the Chancellor's budget was obviously postponed, but there were lots of rumours about some of the changes that were going to come into effect. Most notably, I'd say some of the rumoured increase in taxes on capital, so particularly corporation and capital gains tax. And I would love to find out from the panel what they think the effect of that would be on enterprise and investment into the UK. Is this the right way for us to go to get out of this crisis? So John, I could see you nodding along to some of the things I was saying, so I'm going to look to you first.
So I think we must make the case against Treasury orthodoxy. There seem to be officials in the Treasury who believe there is a fixed pie, and they say, oh dear, the state needs to spend more, it's having to borrow too much, therefore we need to get more tax off the private sector, therefore we need to put up tax rates, take more tax off them, job done, and we will redistribute within this fixed pie. Now, we're all in the business of growing the pie or creating many pies, and we know, as we've all said in our different ways, the way you grow the pie is to reward people for enterprise jobs, work, all the things I described at the beginning. So we have to make two cases to the Treasury, I think, economically. The one I've been making for many years, based on Mr. Laffer's work, which is that if you cut certain tax rates, you will collect more revenue, not less. And we don't need to just be theoreticians or to trust John Redwood, or more importantly, Mr. Laffer. We have history on our side. I remember when Nigel Lawson as Chancellor and Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister cut our income tax from an unbelievable 83% to 40% in 2 stages. And she was told by Treasury orthodoxy, I was trying to counter the argument at the time, that this would be disastrous because we wouldn't collect so much money. What happened? Well, over those 2 big tax cuts, the following things happened. First, the amount of money the rich paid increased in cash terms, bound to. Secondly, the amount of money the rich paid in real terms increased, bound to, because more stayed, more paid, more enterprising. They took more risks, they earned more money. And the third, even more important thing for social justice and the political argument was the rich came to pay a bigger percentage of the total income tax take than they were paying when the rate was 83%, because we used to have something called the brain drain. As soon as somebody got good at doing things, they went offshore because there was no point in staying here, paying 83%. So we need to re-educate some in the Treasury into the joys of Laffer, and at 45%, we're still well above the Laffer optimum level for income tax in the UK. The previous Chancellor did bring it down from 50 to 45. What happened? The amount of money the rich paid went up, of course it did. And we need to carry that across to other taxes. We saw the Treasury have its way with sticking up stamp duty. They forecast big increases in stamp duty revenues, and they spend the next 3 years revising down the forecast because, of course, there were far fewer transactions because people didn't want to pay the much higher rates of stamp duty. Now, this government has very sensibly cut the stamp duty, at least for a few months. There's a big surge in transactions despite the general lack of confidence and poor economic background. So tax cuts definitely work. The second bit of economics we need to explain is the twin deficits. And it is my view that the serious deficit that we need to worry about is not the state deficit, it is the balance payments deficit. And the UK has been running a very high balance payments deficit for many years. And that is more worrying than the state deficit because you depend entirely on the goodwill of foreigners to finance that, because you cannot, by definition, finance it in your own currency, which you control. You have to finance it in foreign currencies, which can be more painful. So we need to work away. And how do you get the balance payments deficit down? Well, the great opportunity now we're coming out of the EU, because we've gone from growing most of our own food of a temperate nature to having a massive import bill thanks to the EU Common Agricultural Policy. We need to turn the deficit round in food with good promotional schemes, including tax cuts, so that we grow more at home and cut the food miles. Same with fishing. We need to catch more of our own fish and land our own fish and process them here for eating. We used to do that prior to the common fishing policy coming along and taking much of our fish into continental hands and continental profitability. And we need to do similar general thing on some industrial products like cars, where others have been talking about how you can provide tax incentives. Because the state deficit is perfectly financeable at the moment. It is huge. It is off the charts. None of us want a deficit that large, but it's better than not having one, given that we've just had a 20% drop in GDP. There has to be an offset. The state had to come in. It's got to be a one-off. It's got to be temporary. But it's eminently financeable because we live in this world where the central banks of advanced countries can create as much of their own currency as they wish. And there's a huge demand by people with savings who want to be bondholders in governments. And so we can finance this deficit at near zero interest rates, as can the Japanese, as can the Europeans, as can the Americans, slightly higher rates in America. And we control that because we have our own central bank, we create our own money, and it's really about a time preference shift in money for savers. So I think we need to explain this economics fully to the Treasury. Of course, there needs to be a big public deficit at the moment because there's just been a huge surge in private saving. That private saving, some of it was involuntary, people couldn't spend, some of it was planned because they're nervous about the future. Some of it's planned because they don't want to spend money on expensive train fares into central London for their job, or they don't want to spend money on some of the other things they used to have to, given the older style of working patterns. And so we've had this big surge in private saving. It has to be offset, otherwise you'll have a much longer and deeper recession. So we must tell the Treasury not to worry short term about all that, and they should get on with those tax cuts, because we do need to promote industry, agriculture, fishing, the other things that can turn around the more serious deficit, which is the international deficit, where you're dependent on the goodwill of foreigners.
Thank you. Sam, if I can go to you for your thoughts, because you spent a lot of your opening remarks talking about investment and companies investing more in their workforce. What do you think is going to be the impact on investment and enterprise if some of these rumoured changes were to come into effect?
I think it would be quite bad. There is one of the nice things about events like this is that you can listen to somebody who you share very similar values to and very similar goals, and disagree with them on a lot. And I have to say I do disagree with quite a lot of what John's just said. One thing I do agree with him on is that I think the Treasury is slightly fixated on debt compared to growth. And I think it's very important that the Treasury realizes and that the government realizes that the whole point of what we're doing right now is to defer the cost and the pain to a time when we can afford to pay it back, and when paying it back will be much less painful. And the whole point of debt is that you wait until you're in a position where it isn't as costly and as painful to repay it. And we're borrowing at very, very, very low rates. The 30-year gilt yields for the UK are, I think, 0.5%. So if there's even a fear that kind of real interest rates will rise and that will kind of lead to a sudden spike in our borrowing costs, then we should just borrow longer. I think it's pretty important. We do need to pay this money back at some point, but I'm not at all convinced that we should be prioritizing that over prioritizing the recovery. I think I do want to say I don't believe that we're on the right-hand side of the Laffer curve, so to speak. I don't believe that there are free tax cuts, except maybe in a few very exceptional edge cases. I think most tax cuts that we want will reduce government revenues in the short and medium term. Maybe in the long run they'll increase them, but we're living in the short run for now. And I think that we need to be honest about that and be open about that. Personally, broadening the VAT base, I think, would be maybe very politically difficult, but could allow us to make everybody really on kind of medium and low incomes better off by raising, I think, something like £60 billion a year by broadening the VAT base. We could use a lot of that to compensate people on middle and low incomes, and use the rest to fix other elements of the tax code. I think a carbon tax is essential. And one of the things that a carbon tax will allow us to do is use those revenues to eliminate other parts of the tax code that are holding back growth to offset the kind of growth costs of a carbon tax. And I think that there are things that we can do around property taxation, so that we're taxing buildings less and taxing the value of land more, which I think would be less distortionary and hit growth less. So I think there are lots of things that we can do, in fact, to raise revenues. I don't at all, I mean, the reason the stamp duty holiday has caused an increase in transactions is partly because everybody's so scared of having to pay stamp duty next year that they're trying to buy their house now, and try to sell their house now. People shift their activity to take advantage of these sort of holidays and these windows. And when the higher rate of tax, the kind of 50p rate was cut to 45p, a lot of people held back drawing income and things like that to take advantage of the lower rate and to kind of shift their income. That's fine. Tax cuts aren't free, and I think it would be unfortunate if we built our case for tax cuts on the notion that they're a free lunch, because I don't think they are.
So Sam has actually very nicely managed to answer the first two questions from our audience, which I haven't even asked yet. So I will pivot slightly to let the questions be answered by the rest of the panel as well. So the first question we have is from Rachel, who actually asked about the carbon tax and says, is it inevitable, and do the public accept it? It's probably needed to help us to meet net zero. So Scott, what are your views from across the pond? Do you think that the UK is headed for a carbon tax, and is it the right step for us to take?
Well, we're certainly having the same discussion here in the United States on whether or not new revenues or new streams of revenues are needed in order to deal with the debt crisis, but also there's obviously great concern about the environment. We've done a lot of analysis of a carbon tax, but our models show that, at least for the US economy, a carbon tax, while certainly raising a lot of revenues, would have a harmful impact on long-term economic growth. However, we have also looked at how you might use those revenues to offset other types of more harmful taxes, such as the corporate income tax, personal income taxes, and so forth. And there we see the shift in the balance between the harm caused by the carbon tax and the positive aspects of lowering the cost of capital. And I think you have to look at this in more holistic terms. There are consequences to these new kinds of revenue sources, and you have to take that into account. It's not all just about saving the environment if you've actually crushed the economy. So my preference, if you're going to have a carbon tax, and I'm on the fence on this, I think you have to offset more harmful taxes in order to balance growth with the efforts to deal with the environmental causes.
And Tom, what's your view? Is a carbon tax coming for the UK, and should it be?
Well, I think we have elements of a carbon tax that sort of are embedded in our system already, but in a slightly higgledy-piggledy, disorganized way. You've got the European emissions trading system, you've got the carbon price floor, you've got various other environmental taxes, and then actually, of course, you've got a whole host of different regulations and directives piled on top of one another, trying to push towards that ultimate goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I think that a carbon tax could be, first of all, an extremely sensible simplification of that whole landscape of environmental taxes. You could probably sweep away an awful lot of regulation, a lot of state direction, and you can establish a sort of single, clear carbon price that tells people how costly it will be to pollute, and therefore hopefully changes their behavior. I think that there's a couple of complicating factors. One is that, as Scott says, I do think that it would weigh heavily on economic growth unless it was offset by good, beneficial pro-growth tax reforms elsewhere. And of course, that's a trade-off that many people will be willing to make when they consider environmental questions. I think the other part of it, a lot of the debate now about the carbon tax is around this issue of border adjustment. And so the argument goes that we'd love to have an internal carbon tax and discourage pollution, but there's really not a great benefit to it if all you do is shift production to other countries that don't care as much, and then you import their products. You've sort of hobbled your own industry without actually reducing emissions globally in any way. And so people have started talking about, well, we'll border adjust the carbon tax, so that when products are brought into the country, in one way or another, the tax system would reflect the emissions that have gone into producing them. And it's sort of one of those things, it's a fine idea in theory. I'm willing to be persuaded that it's doable, but it also sounds like a very dangerous and complicated business to get into to me, because it's one thing to theorize, and it's another to put this through the sort of sausage factory of politics, and possibly end up erecting an enormous new system, effectively of tariffs and trade barriers. And that would be bad in so many different ways. So I think that there's a lot of thinking still to do on the carbon tax before it becomes a fully fledged idea, but it certainly is something that appeals to me in principle.
Okay, and then the other big tax and the change that has been implemented, which everybody is talking about in the questions, but particularly one here from Stephen Greek, who asks, what has been the impact of the temporary cut in stamp duty? We might not fully know the impact of it just yet. Should the cut be made permanent, and should the threshold be raised to £1 million? So John, I will go to you first on what your views are on stamp duty.
I would certainly not put stamp duties up again, and I've made my position very clear on this throughout, and I was one of the MPs who led the argument to get stamp duties reduced on the lower priced houses, which they did do, and I was very pleased about that. And it's quite difficult disaggregating the numbers to find out how big an impact both the cut stamp duty on the cheaper houses and the higher stamp duties on the dearer houses has had. The Treasury are very reluctant to segregate the numbers, which makes me think there's more Laffer effect in there than they want to admit, because they never like admitting that maybe you get a bit more tax when you let people pay a lower rate. But I mean, stamp duty on property is for quite a lot of people an avoidable tax, because they're sitting there in a home. It would be nice to trade down to something warmer, smaller, closer to their children. If they're of a certain age, it would be nice to trade up to something bigger, more accommodating. If they're of a younger age or whatever, people might want to change location. They might want to change the amount of accommodation or the modernity of the accommodation. But they can always put that off or decide they can't afford it. And stamp duty is often the thing that says to them, you know what, I can't really afford this, or it's decent to say, this isn't the perfect location, or it's not the perfect house, but I'll spend a bit more on this house instead of undertaking the move, which might be better for them and for other people in the market. As to carbon taxes, I think there are many more carbon taxes than the ones we've heard about. We're riddled with carbon taxes already. And when people go to buy their petrol or diesel for their vehicle, they're paying something like 63% of the pump price as a carbon tax to the government. It's an extremely high tariff already, but it hasn't proved high enough to get people to forego their diesel or petrol cars and buy electric cars in large numbers. People still are voting massively to stick with the diesel and petrol flexibility because of the problems of charging times and range and uncertainties about battery life and battery reliability on the electric vehicle. And so even when you have a very high carbon tax, it doesn't actually necessarily produce the desired results. You need to get people to buy into this green revolution. You need to generate a new set of popular products. We need entrepreneurs who can find products that we all want to buy. There's no problem about getting people buying into the digital revolution. As soon as the new smartphone or the new pad or whatever comes out, people go out and buy it because they really like it. But when the new electric cars came out, most people said, no, I'm not going to do that. Even if you give me a subsidy, it's not right for me yet. You've got to work on the product. And I'm 100% against a carbon tax on people heating their homes. And we've got a little bit of that already. I think that would be a scandal. I just don't think you should attack the fuel bill to try and force people out of their gas boilers, because fuel is particularly hard hitting on the budgets of people on their incomes. And this green revolution has got to be something people of all incomes can buy into and get something out of. It mustn't be a way to let the rich carrying on do what they want to do and everybody else having real trouble with the bills.
So it's very timely, I think, talking about taxing heating bills on probably what is for most people the first day they've actually put their heating on this year, or this autumn, I should say. Moving on slightly to a different question from Kikistani, and I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly there, They ask, would slashing business rates and potentially VAT help regenerate rundown high streets, especially in parts of the country that are less well off, to allow small businesses to thrive? And I'm going to add onto the bottom of that as well, should we be helping to regenerate rundown high streets? Or is that something that is our high streets a thing of the past? Sam, do you want to come in on that first?
Sure. Something that is often very difficult to get your head around, but the economics, both in terms of the empirics and the theory, are really, really clear in the UK that business rates tend to be a tax on landowners rather than on business occupiers. And what that means is when we increase business rates, rents to landowners from businesses fall in almost direct proportion to the increase in business rates. And similarly, when we cut business rates, rents to landowners rise almost in direct proportion. And we have some really interesting evidence that looks at, different London boroughs where, on one side of the street, you're in one borough and you've had an increase or a decrease in stamp duty, in business rates. And on the other side of the street, in an identical property in all other respects, you haven't. And we look at what's happened to the rental bill. And so that means that when we look at business rates in particular, often there's a danger that when people advocate for cutting business rates with the best will in the world because they want to, leave more money in the pockets of business owners, in fact, what they're doing is leaving more money in the pockets of landowners, which isn't a very efficient way of using, I would say, money that we could be spending on efficient tax cuts. What I would do is to change what we're taxing with business rates, because at the moment, business rates effectively are kind of rental tax, and rent is determined both by the value of the land and by the value of the property, the building on top of the land. And so to the extent that increasing the value of your property increases your rent, and increasing, or the landowner increasing the value of the property increases the rent, it also increases the business rates bill. So there's a disincentive, just like there's a disincentive to invest in machinery with the way we treat capital tax, as I talked about earlier. There's a disincentive to improve rental property because your business rates bill will rise and you'll get less rent from it. So what I would do is move away from a business rates system towards a commercial land value tax. Tax the value of the land, but not the property on top of it. And it can be difficult to assess the difference between those two things. But I think it's possible. One of the big problems with that, and this isn't a problem right now because it's very difficult to move use of buildings from commercial high street use to residential use. But one of the problems with if we do have a more liberal planning system, and if we do make it easier to switch uses like this, is that we introduce a huge tax advantage for moving what's currently business property into residential use, because council tax is so much lower. As a kind of percentage of rent, or as a percentage of the value of the occupying the property. So that would imply that if we are, and I really hope we do liberalize our planning system, I would love an extremely flexible planning system, but if we do that, in order to avoid this huge tax disadvantage for using property for commercial reasons, we'll have to change the way we tax property altogether, and bring in a unified rate for commercial and for residential. And one final point to make about that, and it relates as well to why I think we should tax people's energy use at homes, and I think we should tax energy however people use it, is that what we should care about, in my opinion, and I agree with James Mirrlees, the Nobel Prize winner who wrote the IFS's Mirrlees Review, is that what should matter is the overall progressivity of the tax system, not the progressivity of any individual tax. Because all of it altogether should add up to a system that protects the poor and I think, in fact, gives money to the poor and tops up their wages. But we shouldn't be trying to do that with every individual tax, because that's a recipe for a tax system that's complicated, that's filled with holes and with biases, and ultimately might be a lot more difficult to achieve our ends with than a very simple system where we come in later on and we just give money to the poor to correct for the kind of neutrality of the tax system.
Okay, Tom, do you want to come in on whether we should, would cutting business rates help our high street, and should we help save our high streets?
Yeah, honestly, it's a very difficult issue, especially at a time like this when people, I suppose the trend towards online shopping has really massively accelerated. And of course, people aren't dining out and going to pubs and so on as much at the moment for obvious reasons. And so I think that there's both a COVID-19 element to that, and there's also a a long trend, basically, which has been pushing in that direction. I think I'll say two things. Yeah, I broadly agree with Sam's perspective on business rates that he just put across there. You could make a difference at the margin for some of the struggling high streets around the country if you reform business rates, if you based them on underlying site values. I think the evidence suggests actually that business rates bills would fall for sort of businesses in the north, the Midlands, high streets in the north and the Midlands, and for a lot of manufacturing firms as well. That the way our business rates base is designed at the moment is really not great at all. It discourages investment in properties. It's very bad from a manufacturing perspective, and it also leads to poorer areas actually paying a higher tax bill than is fair, given the underlying sort of fundamentals there. And so I think you can make a little bit of a difference. But honestly, I can't sit here and say that I think that tax changes are really going to make a huge difference to high streets. I think that to me, it's really a land use planning issue. The way that high streets are going to thrive is if they become much more mixed neighborhoods and a lot more commercial is able to turn into residential. That's a good thing because we need more houses, more flats. But then you also you create stronger local markets for the things that high streets offer. But on the other hand, people living in suburban houses with cars are going to carry on shopping at an out of town Tesco or Waitrose or whatever, and buying most of the things they need from Amazon. And I think that we can't really, it's not our job, it's not the government's job to try and manipulate those consumer choices. If that's the way people want to live their lives, they don't want to spend their time in shops and parking in busy town centres. It's unfortunate in many respects, but that's the way it is.
I'm very conscious of time, but I have been saving what I think is quite a nice feisty question from Andrew O'Brien, which I'd like to give you all the opportunity to answer. Andrew asks, politicians and officials love to talk about simplification of the tax system, yet reductions in corporation tax over the decade have not significantly created growth. Should we stop fetishizing simplicity? Scott, do you want to answer that one first?
Well, lower marginal rates on corporations are great. We want to reduce the cost of capital, but too many countries have done what the UK has done, and that's offset lower marginal rates with base broadening that actually counteracts the reduction in the corporate rate. And so they end up getting no overall economic benefit from that. I think the key is to move toward an Estonian type system, which is basically a cash flow tax, much like what Sam was talking about in his introductory remarks. Estonian businesses pay a 20% rate only on what they call distributed profits given to shareholders. All the cash and profits that are retained in the business are not taxed until they are distributed. It's a perfectly neutral system and encourages the right kind of economic growth and in investment. And I would suggest looking at that kind of a system very, very seriously for the UK. You can just focus on corporate rates, but that's not enough. You have to think of the tax base just as much as the rate.
Tom, should we stop just focusing on simplifying the tax system?
Well, so I think that simplification is obviously not enough on its own. If you wanted me to, I could design a tax system that was extremely simple, but absolutely terrible for economic growth and would probably cause widespread suffering and outrage. So simplicity isn't in and of itself, the guiding goal of tax policy. What I would say, though, is that over the years, governments of all political colours have tended to sort of cut the bits of the tax system, the tax rates that people really pay attention to and focus on. And then, sort of giving with one hand, taking away with the other, they've tried to raise the revenue back in other places. And in so doing, they've created an enormous amount of complexity. George Osborne, fine chancellor in many respects, but this was, I think, one of his great failings, that there was always some nasty little policy hidden in the fine print that was clawing back the tax cut that had apparently been given. And the effect of that over time, the accretion of this little tax policy, this little tax policy, this little tax policy, is to create an enormous amount of complexity. And that messes with the incentives in the tax system. I think it's very dishonest, actually, from a government perspective, because you're not being honest with people about how much tax they're expected to pay. And I think that's wrong. And so I think simplicity has to be an important aspect of tax reform. But understanding, as the question rightly points out, that by itself, it doesn't necessarily accomplish all that much.
Sam?
I think one of Adam Smith's most important insights was that consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. And what he meant by that is, when you invest in a company, you invest in order to consume. When I put money into my stocks and shares ISA, it's nice if that grows, but ultimately the reason that I want to do that is to consume. And because of that, in a way, every tax is a consumption tax. It's just that we tax some ways of getting to the consumption much more highly than others. So we say, if you earn £1 and you go out to the shop and spend that on, I don't know, a pair of shoes, or put it towards a pair of shoes, we'll tax you at 20%. But if you earn £1 and you invest it in a business, and you allow that business to create wealth, and you allow it to employ people and to produce output that makes people happy, and you wait and you draw down some of the profits from the wealth you've created so that you have, let's say, £1.20, we're going to tax you at 40%, because of all of the little other taxes along the way that we've created to supposedly tax all these different parts of economic activity. Really, what we're just doing is taxing consumption in a really roundabout and economically damaging way. So I think reframing the way we think about tax so that we realize that really everything is a consumption tax. It's just that some are very, very, very anti-wealth creation consumption taxes, and some are just, unfortunately, the only kinds of taxes that are kind of the least bad taxes we've got, which are just simple consumption taxes like VAT. And kind of simplifying by focusing on consumption, and then coming in afterwards with all the money we raise from tax and just giving people money if they're poor to compensate them for living in a system with a fairly flat rate of tax. I think that's probably the best way of creating wealth, and that's probably the best way of making sure that people on lower incomes aren't left behind.
And finally to Sir John for the final word.
Well, thank you. Briefly on the business rates question. We have a major crisis in our high streets. Online was winning and was putting a lot of pressure on traditional retail, which had overexpanded prior to the COVID-19 problem. And that, of course, was a massive accelerant. And I think a lot of that market share gain by online will be held. And so we have massively over-provided shop accommodation. As some have suggested, there's got to be conversions, and in the more marginal areas or in overextended high streets, there will need to be property conversions, perhaps to domestic. In order for that to happen, values actually have to fall even further, because it's still the case that the shop is allegedly the most valuable kind of use in that kind of property. And business rates is a very major obstacle for easy resolution of this problem. In a recent newspaper article about a series of negotiations between a leading retailer and their various landlords, they've reached a settlement. And I think it was about 70 of their shops. They've said they're only going to carry on the lease if the rent is zero. And the landlord is putting up with that because they will pay the business rate, because the business rate is so large, and it's a contribution that the landlord needs because there's no obvious alternative tenant who will pay a rent. So we've got a very big problem. And business rates is part of the obstacle, and they are far too high. On the general issue, now I'm a keen simplifier of taxes. And there are two ways you simplify taxes. One is you have fewer of them. We have far too many taxes. If you agree with my opening proposition that all taxes are damaging, they get in the way of people's greater happiness and enterprise and living standards. You want as few as possible. And I think what you need to concentrate on are the big taxes we've already got that have a pretty broad base and collect a lot of revenue. And the way to get more revenue out of people is undoubtedly to simplify and lower the rates on those broad-based taxes, as I was illustrating from past experiences of both the Thatcher government and the Osborne-Cameron government more recently. So I'm in favour of lower rates on the broad-based taxes and far fewer taxes. I think all these little taxes are really annoying, and they don't have a particularly good ratio between the amount of money you raise and the costs imposed both on government to raise them and on people to comply with them. You create a lot more criminals because people, usually unwittingly, but occasionally deliberately, don't go along with them. And so you've got more and more compliance and consent issues. If you have a very large and cumbersome and complex tax structure. I think most of us want to be completely compliant with the tax structure. The tax codes are far too voluminous. There are far too many quirks and difficulties in them, so that people who are trying to obey the law need good advice and sometimes get into the wrong position unwittingly. So let's have it simpler, and the way to do it is those few big broad-based taxes with low rates that everybody pays.
Thank you. And I'm sorry to some of our viewers who've asked questions which I didn't have a chance to come to. There were lots of very good ones, and a hugely interesting discussion has been had this afternoon. So thank you to everybody for joining us. I would like to say that going for growth is the topic of our conversation today, and it's a major focus for the Centre for Policy Studies over at least the next 12 months. So if you would like to find out more about work we're doing in this space, please follow us on Twitter at CPS Think Tank, sign up to our newsletter at cps.org.uk, and follow along as well with CapEx, which is our online news platform as well, which does some really interesting pieces and thought leadership, and Sam as well is a regular contributor to CapEx. I would like to thank our incredible panel for their time this afternoon and for such fascinating contributions. So thank you to Sir John, Sam Bowman, Tom Clougherty and Scott Hodge. I'm sure everybody at home is thanking you virtually. And thank you very much. Please stay up to date with the rest of the CPS's programme throughout Conservative Party Conference. It's a very exciting agenda, and we look forward to seeing you virtually at some of our future events. Thank you.